In this video I'll be showing you how to make this mixed metal ring only using copper, brass, and silver wire and a little bit of silver sheet metal. The first thing you're going to need to do is figure out what size the inner band needs to be. I'm going to be using a ring sizer and some calipers to figure this out. Once you find the right size, you're going to need to find the diameter of it, and mine seems to be 18 millimeters. Next, you'll need to measure the thickness of your silver sheet metal. Mine is 0.6 millimeters, so I will take that number and the 18 millimeters and add them together. Once I have the sum of that, I then multiply that by 3.14, and this will give us the measurements for the total length of the silver band, which is about 58.5 millimeters. Then resize your calipers to about 6 millimeters and then scratch a long line going down a flat edge of your silver sheet. Once you have all your lines in place and the markings are clear, we can start cutting it out with a jeweler saw. When cutting pieces like this out, I like to cut the shortest line first and then cut along the longest line second. You can really do this however you prefer though. Also, make sure that you have some sort of lubricant for your blade to make this a lot easier. So once it's all cut out, you're going to need to clean up the edges from the burrs that the saw would leave behind. I'm just going to use a vise and a hand file to do this. When filing like this, make sure to go along the entire piece and make sure it's as uniform as possible. So next we're going to need to anneal this piece so we can actually work it into a ring shape, and I'm going to be using a Smith's little torch to do so, but you can use any torch you see fit. Make sure to evenly heat the piece until it starts glowing a dull red, and then quench it in some water. So after quenching it, make sure to put it into your pickling solution because we're going to be soldering this piece and we need it as clean as possible. So in the meantime, we're going to make the twisted / braided band that's going to go into the center of our ring. The wires I'm using here are both 16 gauge and they're made of copper and brass. We're going to need to cut them to the same lengths, and I'm going to be making way more than I need just in case. Then I'm going to need my vise again, so I can put the ends of these two wires into it, and then the other end will go into a drill. Once in the drill, just pull down the trigger and watch the wire and make sure it's twisting at an even rate, and you can stop whenever you feel the twist is to your liking. Just try not to overdo it because this will actually end up breaking the wire. So now you're going to want to anneal the twisted wire because the process of twisting it work hardened it, and we need it to be softer because we're going to hammer it flat. Since we're annealing, I'm going to anneal this silver square wire also. So now back to the twisted wire. We're going to be hammering it down to give it a different look and flatten it out a little bit. The reason why we're doing this is we don't want it to be taller than the silver wire that's going around it on the outside of the ring. When hammering this piece, make sure to go as even as possible and make sure that it stays as straight as possible, because when you hammer things they tend to warp in different directions. Also, don't hit it too hard or too soft. So now that my silver band is all clean, I'm going to start to form it around my ring mandrel. It really doesn't matter what part you bend it around on the mandrel, I'm just trying to get a curve on one side. The other side I'm going to flatten and bring both edges together. This way I can make a very tight soldering joint. I would suggest using non-marring pliers, or basically pliers that don't have teeth on them to do this. So once you get both pieces as tight as possible, we're going to saw through it, and this will clean up any imperfections or spaces in them and make it so when we solder it, we won't have any holes or problems. So now we're going to solder this. We're going to flux the whole piece, and especially where the solder joint is going to be, and then I'm going to use a third hand and face the flat side down. Then all I'm going to do is place 2 hard solder chips on the inside. And then I'm going to evenly heat the entire piece, and if the solder jumps and moves around, make sure to recenter it onto the line that we cut through it. And once everything flows, we should be done with this, and you can quench it and then make sure to pickle the piece, and then we can move on to shaping it around the mandrel to get it back into a ring shape. I'm using a rawhide mallet to do so it doesn't leave any marks. I'll continue to do this until it is a pretty much perfect circle, and make sure not to do this too much or you can actually stretch the ring and make it sized wrong. So you can even mark a part on the mandrel not to pass. So then I'm just going to clean up the inside of the ring and the solder joint as much as possible with this rotary tool. So now we're going to need to find all the measurements for the outer rings, and to do this you just basically measure the ring that you made and use that as its diameter, and then add the thickness of whatever rings you're adding on top of it. So like the twisted one, make sure to measure in multiple points to make sure it's all the same size, and if not, go back and hammer it and smooth it out. And pretty much the same thing for the square wire, just make sure it's flat and measure it. And just plug those numbers into the basic equation that I showed earlier, which is the diameter plus the thickness, and then you take that and multiply it by 3.14. So we're going to do the same thing we did with the inner band that we made with the silver pieces of wire. Just round them around the mandrel and then flatten them out, and then cut through them like we did last time. After we cut the twisted wire to length and file down the ends so they're as flat as possible, we're going to want to solder them together to make it one piece. This will make it so it doesn't spread apart as we're bending it. So far we've only used hard solder on everything, so stick with that for now. Also make sure to pickle this piece because we're going to have to solder the ends together next. As we wait for the twisted metal to clean itself off in the pickle, we need to solder these two silver parts. There's an easy way to solder pieces like this. All you need to do is put a piece of solder onto your charcoal block, then put flux all over the piece that you're wanting to solder, and then put the joint directly on top of the solder. When you heat it up, the solder will flow upwards and the piece will be soldered. After quenching them, I'm going to use the mandrel to turn them into actual ring shapes, and then test fit them onto the center piece. Same thing as before, make sure not to overstretch these, because if they get too big, you won't be able to solder them properly to the inner shaft of the ring. And make sure to test fit your parts, just to be sure that everything's going to line up properly before you solder them. Like here, I found out that my center ring isn't 100% round, so I went back and fixed that. So now everything lines up as intended. So now that our twisted metal is out of the pickling solution and all cleaned, I'm going to clean it up a little bit more so I can see what I'm working with and if everything looks right using this sanding disc. With that done, we can make sure to test it between the two outer silver bands and make sure everything lines up right, and then move on to forming it into a ring shape, flattening one side, and soldering it like all the rest. So for this piece I decided to use the third hand, but it's not really absolutely needed for this. You can also lay it down on the block just like I did before, but this is just my preference for this particular piece. If you do it like this, be very careful with the flame, because it'll make the solder actually pop off and you'll have to reset it. So just try to heat it up pretty slowly. So once this piece was done, I quenched it and shaped it back into the ring shape that it needed to be, and then I took all my ring pieces and pickled them because we're going to be moving on to soldering them all together. So now we're going to make sure that all of our bands are as flat as possible. This will make it so everything lines up when we solder it and we won't have any gaps between them. The best way to do this is to use a flat surface like the anvil part of my bench pen and a small hammer just to hammer things down. And test fit everything again and keep doing this until everything is as close as you can possibly get it. And to make sure that I don't actually dent the metal or warp it in any way, I'm using the rawhide mallet for this. So finally it's time to start putting everything together. So the first thing I'm going to do is put the center shaft down and flux all the outside of it, and then the first silver ring will go over it with flux on it also. Also try to make sure that the area that you're soldering on is as flat as possible. So now I'm going to add my pieces of medium solder on top of the outer silver band. You can also use easy or extra easy solder, since this will be the last soldering step and we won't need to add anything else. You can also use paste solder for this, but I only have these solder chips, so this is what I'm going to have to use. So now we're just going to flux the twisted wire part and then put that on top of the chips and the other band on the bottom. Try to be very careful when putting this piece on, because you want to keep the solder chips between it and the bottom piece. If they fall out, you have to lift it up a little bit and make sure to put them back with some tweezers. When soldering like this, the setup seems to be the most important part of it all. So if you nail the setup, then you won't have to go back and fix any little things, or you won't have to solder multiple times. And now for the final ring, just put flux on it like we did before and stack the pieces on top of the twisted ring now, and then place the silver ring on top of that. So when soldering this piece, you're going to want to heat the whole thing in circular motions, not staying in one spot for too long, and watching for the solder to flow. And if any of the parts start to move out of place or aren't lining up properly, you can use your tweezers to push them down, or you can use a solder pick even. Just when pushing things down, make sure that your soldering area is secure. Like I'm on a tripod, so if I'm in the center of it and push down, that's fine, but if I was on the edge, I would knock over everything. So after all that and quenching this piece, it looks like the bands are a little bit off right here. So I'm going to have to pickle the whole thing, reflux it, and then heat it up again to fix my little mistakes. So yeah, if you're new at this or not comfortable with having to fix the little problems like that, I would highly suggest not using silver to start with and just use copper brass for the whole ring, and then make sure to get everything down, then move on to using the silver with the mixed metals. So once I have that quenched, I'm going to put it back onto my mandrel and hammer it down a bit to make sure any warping or uneven spots are made round again. And then we're going to actually hammer it more onto the mandrel so it's basically stuck, because we're going to have to file the edges down to make everything a nice flush finish. For this step, if you happen to have a lathe that you can put this in, this will make this 1,000 times faster. But I don't, so I'm going to hand file this in a curved motion until it is all flush and everything looks exactly how I want it to. Make sure to keep turning the mandrel pretty often so you don't end up with flat spots. So once you're done with the sides, you're going to move on to the top and bottom. They're going to have a little bit of this middle silver piece sticking up through them, because I made it a little bit longer than the thickness of all three of them stacked up. So you have to get back to filing that down, and then sanding it with about 220 grit sandpaper to smooth it all out. It's really just a lot of filing and sanding at this point. Once you have all that done, go ahead and check your piece to make sure everything is as even as you want it to be, and make sure you can actually roll without getting stuck on any points, because that will mean you have a flat point that you need to go back and re-round out along with most of the rest of the ring to make it even. So I found a couple little bits that need to be bent down a little bit more, so I'm just going to lightly tap them with the hammer until they bend into place. Also, it looks like on the top and bottom I need to add a little bit more solder to fill in the gaps between the middle ring and the outside rings. So I'm just adding some easy solder to the gap areas, and then I'll be able to sand it off once I'm done to remove any of the excess. So I'm going to start to use some sanding discs to clean it up even more and get it to the point where we can start polishing it. So this is 220 grit, and then I'm going to move to 600. Then I'm going to use an emery wheel on the inside and some of the outside a little bit. And now it's finally time to start polishing it. I'm going to be using a felt wheel and some silver polishing compound. Make sure you have something that you can hold the ring with that's not going to scratch it up, because the ring gets extremely hot during this process. So there we go, just about finished. It looks like it has a small imperfection where the twisted metal ring came together. The solder pulled away from it a little bit, but other than that, everything looks pretty good. So it still has a couple little gaps on the sides that I need to go back and fill in, but I'll do that at a later date. So for the very last thing you need to do if you polish anything is clean off the polishing compound. To do this, I use a really cheap Sonic jewelry cleaner, some hot water, and some normal dish detergent, and a toothbrush. If you don't have a Sonic cleaner, just use a bowl with hot water in it and the toothbrush along with the soap. What I do is I basically scrub the piece down a bit before putting it into the cleaner, and the cleaner will break loose anything else, and once I pull it out, it's perfectly clean. Once this is all done and dried off, make sure to seal it with something like a Renaissance wax or even a lacquer so your metals don't tarnish. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, make sure to leave a thumbs up on this video, and if you have any questions, make sure to leave a comment, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. So I've got a lot of requests for making this ring into a spinner ring, so I'll be making that in one of my upcoming videos. So if you want to see that, make sure to subscribe to this channel, and it'll keep you updated on anything that comes out from me. Also, for this particular ring, I did a live stream that took about 4 hours from start to finish, and I'll have a link to that in the description if you actually want to see in real time how this was made. So that's about it, so I'll see you guys next time. Bye!